Hello and welcome. Yesterday, I published an article, a broadcast about Sarah Mullally's election, and looking at the way in which the Reverend Paul Williamson had disrupted the event by making a protest. The reason for this second article is that a lot more has come to light since then, partly because Paul got in touch with me to explain why he did what he did, and I found his explanation very, very moving and very illuminating, and I thought it important enough to expand it and put it here. But also because one of my correspondents sent me an article published by a magazine called The Fence, called In the Shadow of St. Paul's, which explained the background to this pernicious document that led to the suicide of Alan Griffin. So let's start for the two reasons that Paul Williamson made his objection. The first is, as you'll see in a moment, that the Church of England made it almost impossible for anyone to object to the election of Bishop Mullally by its arcane rules. And secondly, the death of Alan Griffin was profoundly shocking to many people. And when it emerged what lay behind it, the scandal of the innuendo and a document that was full of gossip in particular, which was overseen by Bishop Mullally, and the consequences led to the death of Alan Griffin. This was the motivation for Paul to stand and make his objection. So what we're going to do in this next episode is to look at exactly what took place behind the scenes. So first of all, Paul Williamson explains himself in an interview with Dan Wooton, and I'll put the link in the show notes below. But he pointed out that his frustration that led to him to make an intervention in the public service was based firstly on the fact the church made it extremely difficult for anyone wanting to lodge a serious protest to do so. The rules governing when and how a protest can be approved, whether it would be made admissible or public, were very opaque. And every attempt that Paul Williamson had made to bring his documented concerns about Sarah Mullally's competence to the attention of the Church of England authorities was, he maintains, deliberately frustrated by them. There is an arcane law, for example, stating that no objection to the election of the Archbishop of Canterbury will be countenanced if it takes place after the king has rubber-stamped the appointment, which he does. But there's no indication given of the date when that's going to take place. And all Mr. Williamson was told was that his attempt to lodge his protests were out of time and inadmissible. The rubber stamping had taken place. The Church of England, as Paul points out, gives the impression, with serious admonitions in the liturgy, both at weddings and at ordinations, that if people protest because there's something wrong in what is taking place, it will be listened to. Paul Williamson makes a point that it's entirely unfair and institutionally improper to have different rules, for example, for the consecration of bishops and archbishops, particularly in circumstances when there's no openness about what those rules are, or at least no publicity about them. But the main source of Paul Williamson's distress, and the reason for his objection concerns a safeguarding failure that led to the suicide of a priest in the Diocese of London. The facts behind this event are deeply tragic, and they are as follows. A retiring diocesan fixer in London Diocese compiled an informal set of notes as part of his handing over to the Archdeacon of London on his retirement. The author's name was Martin Sargent. The document, this brain dump on his retirement, or being eased out as it was in the new episcopal regime, became known as the Two Cities document because it related to the wider city of London and the narrower city of Westminster, both covered by the Diocese of London north of the river. The magazine, The Fence, carried an expose of this Two Cities document and a commentary on it, which it published in March 2024. And I'm astonished its publication has had so little impact given the attempted elevation of Sarah MULLALLY to Canterbury. I remember hearing about it, and I think catching a glimpse of it, but it disappeared off the scene. And I've been sent a fresh copy of it by one of our listeners, and for that I'm extremely grateful. Listen to how it describes the author of this Two Cities brain dump, Martin Sargent. Sargent became adept at evading scrutiny and complaints about his machinations, which were ignored. In 2009, Sargent took on, some say invented, the role of head of operations for the cities of London and Westminster. It was the only part of the Anglican Church which was bucking decline, and ambitious plans were made to start 100 new churches by the year 2020. Someone was needed to help backwards parishes navigate this new era of innovation and to wring out more cash, out of the lucre-loaded skyscrapers of the square mile of London. Even as he ascended to become the bishop's factotum, this is before Sarah MULLALLY, of course, Sargent was careful to sidestep accountability. He was never employed by the diocese, which held no personnel file on him, and he was never interviewed for any possession or had his reference checked. Instead, he had no manager or job description and was paid directly by the bishop at the time, Richard Charters. There he operated as a spider in the middle of the web, said Mr. Warner, who's a priest in the Diocese of London, commenting to The Fence. More and more churches came under his sway or in his debt, enmeshed in a complex financial transactions. Sargent alone knew whose money was whose and in which bank account. None of us had any idea what pot we were bidding into and who was controlling it, but you had to make sure that Martin Sargent liked you, said Simon, anonymised, another City of London Anglican clergyman. You'll see why this background pertains to the death of Alan Griffin and the question of Sarah MULLALLY's competence in a short moment. This document, The Two Cities, contained a wide variety of material describing a large number of clergy with no attempt to distinguish rumour and gossip from fact. The writing was informal and unverified, and it contained a great deal of sensitive personal information. One of its most lurid entries alleged that the Rev'd Alan Griffin had AIDS, used rent boys, and had unsuccessfully attempted suicide on 2 occasions. The coroner, after Alan Griffin's death, ruled there was no evidence to support any of the allegations against the Rev'd Alan Griffin, and that his subsequent suicide was rooted in the stress and distress caused by the gossip about him contained in this report and the way in which was circulated and mishandled by the Diocese of London at the time when Sarah MULLALLY was its bishop. The coroner described the case as a catastrophic safeguarding failure by the Diocese of London and its bishop, Sarah MULLALLY. Bishop MULLALLY denied having read this report and claimed that all she had done was to pass it on to other officials. Her critics, however, claim that a diocesan bishop receiving a document of this gravity, containing so much sensitive and confidential information about her clergy, would be expected by the ordinary standards of leadership responsibility at least to read an executive summary. What was it? What's in it? How can it be relied on? Should it be relied on? To ascertain the nature and severity of its contents, and immediately to halt its circulation if, as it obviously was and proved to be, in any way unreliable. Not just unreliable, in fact, it was scurrilous. To say that it was received but not read led to the accusation that this response by Sarah MULLALLY was incongruous with episcopal duty. Regardless of the merits of her claim, she was entitled to delegate the reading of it to others. And it was confirmed by the coroner that the document was full of inaccurate and harmful information, that such a document containing so many mistakes and misrepresentations was retained and circulated within safeguarding systems is seen as constituting a serious misjudgment by the diocese, primarily, but also, by implication, by the bishop in charge of the diocese. I think the only way you can judge quite how awful this was is to have an excerpt from it. So here is an excerpt published by The Fence describing the episode that concerned Alan Griffin. But first, Hugo. Hugo is not the real name of this clergyman. It's anonymized for obvious reasons. You'll see why we begin with it. Hugo, one of the 42 clergy gossiped about in the Two Cities report, was staggered to read his excerpt. Quote, "Chaos seems to gather around him," his section begins, before recounting an error-strewn story about a mentally ill parishioner who'd falsely accused the priest of a gay affair. It then describes Hugo as a, quote, "classic bachelor," before noting his vicarage could do with a good clean. But it was the next part which really horrified Hugo. Quote, "There was an accusation that Hugo had a student living with him in the vicarage. The young man in question was not a secret toy boy, as the brain dump implied. Actually, it turned out to be, in reality, Hugo's godson. The youngster's father had abandoned the family years earlier, and he'd lost his mother to suicide. And Hugo said he was now the closest I'll ever have to a son, and of course I gave him keys, a room, and any time permission to come into the vicarage." Well, Martin Sargent portrayed this relationship as something utterly and disgracefully and untruthfully different. For many of the 42 priests, emotions still run high. Betrayal and bewilderment mark their conversations. Some of them fear their reputations have been permanently blackened. But all the suffering inflicted on these priests pales into comparison with the fate of poor Alan Griffin. Griffin, a somewhat lonely and vulnerable gay man, had been a vicar in the city since 2001. By the end of the decade, was well acquainted with the ubiquitous head of ops, Martin Sargent. Around 2010, Sargent, always greedy for gossip, uncovered Griffin's greatest and most vulnerable secret. The cleric was HIV positive. Distressed after his diagnosis and wrestling with problems in his parish, Griffin attempted suicide a few months later after discovering he was HIV positive. It was Sargent, in fact, who found him in the vicarage and rushed him to hospital. Soon afterwards, Griffin negotiated a generous retirement deal, secured a parish house on peppercorn rent for life on top of his pension. A year later, in 2012, he left the Church of England and became a Roman Catholic. 7 years passed without any incident, and a priest called Warner, who was a neighbour of Griffin's in retirement, would sometimes enjoy pizza and drinks with the retired priest. He was, said Warner, slightly prickly, primish, spiritualist sort of thing. He had a waspish tongue, and after a couple of gins, we'd put the world to rights, said Warner. It's hard to imagine Griffin enjoying a quiet retirement after a troubled end to his career, giving much thought to the interfering fixer, Martin Sargent. But Sargent had plenty to share and had written it down. In the meeting, Sargent claimed that Griffin had frequented rent boys, a comment which landed, this is a meeting with the Archdeacon of London, as he passed over the Two Cities brain dump. So this comment landed on the desk of the safeguarding team as a, quote, priest recklessly paying for underage sex whilst HIV positive. This wasn't true, of course. Then the safeguarding machine in the Diocese of London cranked into gear, and the narrative is clear to follow from the diocese's later inquest. An independent investigator had been appointed, and information, including Griffin's HIV status, had been shared with the Roman Catholic Diocese of Westminster, which swiftly launched its own parallel inquiry. All the way through this, as they questioned him, officials refused to tell Griffin what he was being investigated for. In December of that year, a distraught and bewildered Griffin attempted suicide by overdose. It took until the following September before he was presented with the full allegations that he was being inquired into over. A later review said that Griffin was horrified and appalled both by the claims and by the leaking of his private health information. He was deeply upset the investigators kept on insisting on an in-person meeting, despite him trying to self-isolate during COVID. As an HIV-positive man, he felt particularly vulnerable. In November, overwhelmed and heartbroken, he made a final attempt on his life, and this time he succeeded. The coroner's inquest into the death of Alan Griffin was a crucial moment in exposing the toxic world that Martin Sargent and the Anglican Diocese of London had created. At the inquest, Sargent conceded the critical phrase "rent boys," which triggered the entire investigation into Griffin, was actually his own wording. He'd invented it. Contrary to the language used in the brain dump, the document, The Two Cities, he admitted that he knew that Griffin had never paid for sex. And thanks to the HIV treatment, the cleric's viral load was so low, there was in fact, had he done so, no risk of transmission. Mary Hassel, the furious coroner, found Griffin had died by suicide in despair at those unfounded allegations. Every allegation was untrue. Griffin had not abused children, he'd not had underage sex, he'd not visited prostitutes, he'd not risked transmitting HIV, she concluded. In fact, she was so incredulous as a coroner at the fiasco by the Diocese of London that she issued a rare Prevention of Future Deaths report, warning that without sweeping changes, a comparable tragedy could happen again. But nobody took a jot of responsibility after the coroner's report. Sargent, the author, Luke Miller, the Archdeacon, Sarah MULLALLY, the Bishop, the head of safeguarding, and, of course, the author of the brain dump, all told the coroner they were just passing on information. It was only the coroner's scathing criticism which prompted the diocese to admit the existence of Sargent's list, which until that point had been hidden. The 41 remaining named priests received emails regretfully informing them they had been victims of Sargent's poisoned pen, along, of course, with Alan Griffin, who is now dead. As the astonished 41 other clergy began poring over their entries, the rest of Sargent's deceptions finally unravelled. One church which worked with him was beginning to wonder where all their money had gone. St. Stephen's Walbrook, the historic church parish next to Bloomberg's London offices, had never seen a penny of the $550,000 they were owed by the developers. They shopped Martin Sargent to the police, and by 2022 he'd pleaded guilty to defrauding a total of £5.2 million from the Diocese of London. The author of this terrible report that led to Alan Griffin's death was jailed for 5 years. Slander, fraud, deceit, and the tragic death of a vulnerable old man, all of this in the Diocese of London. Who was to blame for it? For many of the victims of this miserable episode, they blame the Bishop of London, Sarah MULLALLY. She may claim, with justification, to have purged the diocese of some of its murkier elements that she inherited, but she was ultimately in charge during the disastrous denouement of Martin Sargent's career. Even those like Hugo, who concede that the diocese had long been a cesspit of toxicity before MULLALLY arrived, insisted that MULLALLY, who oversaw both the exit interviews and the brain dump investigations of Martin Sargent, was herself to blame. Apparently, almost nobody believes her claims that despite this oversight, she never actually read the Two Cities report itself. Quote, "MULLALLY is all about process, but she's also incompetent," said Hugo, with obvious bitterness, one of the 41. She has no pastoral ability or discernment. As a rather boring woman into process, as one of the 41 priests put it, the come down from the dramatic and mercurial predecessor, Richard Charters, has been severe, and, in one case, for Alan Griffin, fatal. So critics of Bishop Mullally have expressed skepticism about her claim she didn't read the Two Cities document. They argue that a document of such gravity would ordinarily require scrutiny, and that simply passing it on as she said she did and delegating it to others represents an abrogation of responsibility. What did the coroner find? The findings of Mary Hassel involved 3 categories of failure: the creation and retention of unverified, inaccurate information, the inappropriate circulation of that information, and the complete failure to safeguard the well-being of any individual named in the report, all 42 of them. Those who want Sarah Mullally held accountable point out that the retention, circulation, and mishandling of false safeguarding information occurred under her episcopal authority and oversight. They complain bitterly in the light of Alan Griffin's suicide in response to the accusations made against him that it is seriously morally wrong for there to have been no meaningful accountability within the diocese, and that such responsibility ultimately rests with the diocesan bishop. So the Reverend Paul Williams' justification for standing up at that event, which confirmed the election of Sarah Mullally to the archbishopric, his justification for protesting at that moment is presented by him as a demand for accountability, which he believes was entirely absent within the practice of the Church of England in general and the Diocese of London in particular. He said to me he wanted justice for his dead colleague. Let's continue to ask questions about Sarah Mullally's competence and authority. Her first career led to her rising to the top of the administrative branch of her nursing profession. It was widely assumed she must therefore have been a very highly competent administrator. But the lamentable failures that led to the death of Alan Griffin in the case of the Two Cities document, combined with the complaints that we covered in yesterday's broadcast by the victim of the clerical sexual abuse, suggested that her reputation for the highest standards of administration were misplaced. At the very least, critics point out that she presided over safeguarding culture that was crippled by incompetent managerialism, risk avoidance, and procedural insulation. These two scandalous safeguarding failures, the witness N and Alan Griffin, will persuade many that the Church has got it wrong in attempting to promote Sarah Mullally to the highest office within the Church of England. But additionally, there's concern that she is so deeply committed to progressive values and ideology, values that many conservatives and traditionalists believe to be seriously at variance with Christian teaching and theology, also rule her out for this supreme responsibility. So let's look at the scope of Sarah Mullally's progressive commitments. If we look at 9 areas of progressive ideology, each of which causes worry to conservative or traditional Christians, we can begin to grasp the scope and depth of her progressive theology and outlook, and the degree to which her episcopal ministry has been shaped by what we now call wokeness. She's a woke woman bishop par excellence. Let's take an issue that matters enormously to Christians. First of all, abortion. On this issue, her position is explicit and unambiguous. She's a straightforward, vigorous feminist. She's consistently supported the liberalization of abortion law in the United Kingdom, publicly welcomed the decriminalization of abortion in Northern Ireland, and endorsed the extension of abortion access under the rubric of healthcare. Her framing of abortion has been predominantly in terms of women's rights rather than the moral tragedy of the death of the fetus. Death, we might say murder. For critics, this represents a decisive break with historic Anglican moral teaching, replacing a Christian theological anthropology in which the unborn child is a moral subject with the liberal prioritization of individual feminist autonomy. Well, the second area is same-sex marriage and LGBTQ affirmation. And this is one of the most central and controversial planks of Mullally's progressive profile. She's been amongst the most prominent Episcopal supporters of LGBTQ inclusion, strongly backing same-sex blessings in church, publicly affirming same-sex relations as morally valid in the Christian economy. Her support for the trajectory that culminated in Living in Love and Faith, a document in the Church of England, was clear, as was her criticism of opponents, whom she has described for disagreeing with her as pastorally harmful. Critics argue that here sexual ethics are treated as culturally contingent rather than, as they should be, within a Christian denomination as doctrinally grounded, and the traditionalists are marginalized, not through theological argument, but through institutional pressure. Basically, MULLALLY will have you cancelled. Third, transgender ideology and gender identity. MULLALLY has supported trans-affirming positions both within the church and in public discourse. She's endorsed gender self-identification frameworks, supported the inclusion of trans clergy and laity without any theological interrogation of gender theory, and resisted rhetoric that questions contemporary trans ideology on the grounds it might cause harm. For her critics, this signals a rejection of created sexual difference and a replacement of Christian anthropology with contested social theory. Many of us would argue, who defends the poor children who suffered from this social contagion, who get handed over to surgeons to be applied with drugs and surgically have their genitals amputated? Not Sarah MULLALLY, the nurse. Slave reparations. She's been a vocal supporter of institutional repentance and reparative justice, backing the Church of England's reparations fund, endorsing language of institutional guilt for historic slavery, including support for wealth transfer framed explicitly in racial terms. Her critics object that this approach treats moral responsibility as hereditary and racialized, which of course is nonsense for Christians. It replaces Christian repentance with identity-based collectivism. It flattens historical complexity, including the involvement of the African elites in the slave trade itself. We could say so much more about this puerile, progressive idiocy, but let's move on. Fifth, feminism, women's leadership theology. As the first woman Bishop of London, MULLALLY's openly embraced feminist categories. She frequently frames opposition to women's ordination as a structural injustice and tends to interpret resistance through power analysis rather than the claims of sacramental theology. She has shown little patience for sustained theological dissent on women bishops. Critics argue that this collapses theology into politics, treating doctrinal objections as prejudice, misogyny, rather than serious theological claims. Sixthly, safeguarding maximalism. MULLALLY has strongly supported an expansive safeguarding regime within the church, but to no great effect, it seems. This includes prioritizing risk aversion over evidential clarity, treating allegations as safeguarding facts pending review, and accepting systems that blur the distinction between accusation and guilt. Increasingly, critics argue that procedural justice has replaced moral justice, with clergy treated less as moral agents and more as institutional liabilities. Seventh, critical race-adjacent language. Although she's careful in her phrasing, MULLALLY's endorsed concepts closely associated with critical race theory, including the language of institutional racism, diversity training grounded in systemic guilt, and alignment with secular racial justice discourse. Critics argue that this imports secular ideological frameworks, constructed by the left, of course, into ecclesial life, instead of grounding justice in Christian moral teaching rooted in sin, repentance, and redemption. 8. Climate activism. She supported climate activists strongly, including church divestment strategies, the use of climate emergency languages, and framing ecological issues as morally urgent, quasi-political terms. Critics don't deny the legitimacy of environmental concern, but they argue that this reflects activism rather than theology and risks instrumentalizing the church for political causes. Lastly, 9. Synodality and managerial governance. Catholics will wince at the word synodality. MULLALLY consistently supports synod-led moral change, managerial oversight of doctrine, process-driven authority rather than magisterial teaching. For critics, this amounts to a form of bureaucratic Protestantism, authority without truth, process without doctrine, governance substituted for teaching, and procedure replacing moral clarity. Taken together, these 9 areas do not represent isolated prudential disagreements. They form a rather terrifying, coherent ideological pattern. What troubles her critics is not merely that MULLALLY holds progressive views, but that those views consistently displace Christian theological reasoning with political, managerial, or therapeutic categories. In other words, she's gone fully secular woke, leaving the church increasingly governed by consensus, compliance, and risk management rather than doctrine, sacrament, and moral truth. Taken together, these issues outlined above raise a very grave question about the wisdom of promoting Sarah MULLALLY to the highest office in the Church of England at precisely the moment when the public trust in institutions, ecclesial, moral, and administrative, is at its weakest. Is hers an adequate profile for even being a leading Christian voice in a community? Is it a remotely credible candidature for the Archbishop of Canterbury? So the problem is not simply that Bishop MULLALLY holds progressive views. The Church of England has always contained a range of theological and political instincts. That's just how it is. Like it or leave it. I left it. The deeper difficulty is that her record exemplifies a pattern of leadership in which managerial process repeatedly displaces moral judgment, in which ideological alignment becomes a substitute for theological reasoning, and in which procedural installation replaces personal accountability. Nowhere has this been more painfully exposed than in safeguarding, where failures were not merely technical but human, and where the consequences, as we've seen, were tragically irreversible. The Church of England is already struggling to persuade the nation that it can be trusted to speak in a way that's consistent with the Christian faith, the faith it professes, to exercise genuine Christian moral authority, to care for the vulnerable without leftish ideological fear or dogmatic favour. In such circumstances, to promote a woman like Sarah MULLALLY, so closely associated with unresolved safeguarding failures and progressive ideological capture, risks reinforcing the public suspicion that institutional self-protection matters to the COV more than justice, truth, repentance, or fidelity to what has always, until the last few years, been understood to be Anglican Christianity. This isn't just a matter of sensible and responsible church governance. There is a strong suspicion that the COV, beginning with its appointment system, has fallen into the hands of ideological, managerial fundamentalists whose judgments are not only profoundly sub-Christian, but deeply flawed. The Archbishop of Canterbury is, of course, not simply a denominational figurehead. He, or she really, functions, however imperfectly, as a moral symbol to the nation. To elevate a leader whose tenure is marked by contested accountability, opaque governance, and a consistent alignment with elite, progressive, secular ideologies is to widen the already dangerous gap between the church and the people it claims to serve. And to do it after the forced resignation of Justin Welby for exactly similar weaknesses is a piece of institutional folly of the most serious caliber. At a time when the country is looking for moral seriousness, transparency, and courage, this appointment risks signalling the opposite. Despite its repeated inane rhetoric that after every crisis and every failure, lessons have been learned, it's obvious that the Church of England has learnt little, and it remains more comfortable marginalising orthodox dissent than confronting its own failures on its own terms. The cost of that choice will not be borne by an increasingly distrusted clerical hierarchy alone, but by damage to the credibility of the Church's witness in a society that appears already to have drifted rapidly beyond its reach. Well, there are deeper implications too for Catholics beyond just the lament that the Christian tradition has been captured and spiritually neutered. It constitutes a warning that the siren calls of feminism, wokery, and progressivism lead into a spiritual cul-de-sac. Our progressives are trying exactly the same repertoire of wokery, beginning with the incessant demands for women deacons. If we ever doubted that this is what the end of that process looks like, we don't anymore. But it also constitutes a call for Catholics to resume their place in English society, which they held for over 1,200 years before Henry VIII, the conscience and the care of the soul of this nation. There has emerged a spiritual vacuum that needs to be filled, and only the Catholic Church can fill it.